Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Scott Young says you can get better at anything. Let's put Scott to the test. Scott, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now we're going to really put you on the grill. Your book,
Sure.
The 12 Maxims for Mastery, Get Better at Anything. Am I correct?
Yes, get better at anything. Yes.
Okay, you said it, so now we're going to put you to the test. And now my first question, as we were talking about a little before the show, what do most people come up to you and say? Do they want to get better at golf, square dancing, dating, or just making a lot of money?
Well, I mean, all of those things. But to me, I think the thing that I'm so surprised by is just the variety of things that people want to get better at. Every single day I get an email from someone who wants to learn something that I've never even heard of before. So, I got an email from a guy who was trying to learn some complicated system for robots that use saws for some sort of manufacturing process, or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or French, or what have you. There's just such a variety of skills that are out there to learn. And so part of my joy of doing this is just being able to hear those people's stories and their challenges.
I'm just thinking that this might be the basis for a reality show. If you can do it at a nice beach resort and have people in bathing suits and bikinis, and then whatever they want to master, whether it's the jiu-jitsu or French or underwater diving, etc., we might have a little fun.
See if Jeff Probst is available. Right?
There you go. Now, basically, I remember hearing a couple of years ago that there was a ground rule. You have to have 10,000 hours of practice or something like that to master something. And I think that became kind of a common rule that a lot of authors accepted, etc. What are some of the misconceptions about mastering a skill?
Right. So the 10,000 hour rule, I think it was really popularized in Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. It's sort of drawn on Anders Ericsson's research on deliberate practice. Now, there's a few misconceptions about that. One of them was the idea that it was just simply racking up enough hours made you an expert on something. And this is clearly not the case. I mean, Anders Ericsson's original research was trying to discover why some people were elite performers, and most people, even if they spend, their entire career doing something, do not become elite performers. And his answer was that there was a special kind of practice, deliberate practice, that was important, this sort of striving, active effort to make small tweaks to your performance under the guide of a coach and with immediate feedback that actually led to improvement. And that for most people, just doing something repeatedly, it wouldn't necessarily make you reach very high levels of performance. So I think that was one of the misconceptions. I personally think the 10,000 hour rule is maybe a little overstated. I definitely think you need lots of time to become world class at a competitive skill, but I do think the amount of time probably varies depending on what it exactly is you're trying to master.
Now, I think it's early on in the book, you talk about 3 factors for getting better at anything. Mm-hmm. So to start us off, what 3 factors should we be aware of?
Yeah, so I summarize them as see, do, and feedback. So see is the idea that most of what we know comes from other people. And so the ability to learn from the examples, experiences of others really determines to a large extent how much we're able to improve ourselves. Do is the idea that we need to practice to improve, but not every kind of practice equally matters. We just talked about one example there with deliberate practice. The brain is an effort-saving machine, and so if you are doing the wrong kind of efforts, you can spend a lot of time doing something and not get that much better. And then, of course, feedback matters because it's not enough to just do something perfectly the first time. We need to make iterative adjustments to the skills and knowledge domains that we're working on.
Now, I have a lot of friends that as soon as they want to do something different or, either fix a car or whatever it might be, they just go to their phone right away. And I marvel how easily they come up with changing a tire, cleaning a grill, fixing the stove. Does technology, not that it has to have a role, but in your studies, does that help us today to get better at something? If we're, let's say we're in a location where not next to a major city or access to a lot of the things we have here, does the technology help the people? I
mean, it certainly can. I think, you just used the example of fixing your car, but YouTube has made it so much easier to learn how to do home improvement projects or learn lots of skills, because pretty much anything that you can possibly think of doing, there's someone who's made a little video of how to fix this particular IKEA furniture module, and you can go up and look and see how to do that. Whereas before it would have maybe been hard to do that. But I think there's also sort of a double-edged sword for technology, because while there's lots of useful knowledge and tools and things that we can use to improve ourselves, there's also lots of things we can waste time on as well. So I think it's probably not the case that everyone is using technology to learn better, but there's certainly some people who are.
Now, I took a quote from your book. You said, access to an environment where knowledge resides is often a bigger hurdle to mastery than learning itself. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, well, it just means that a lot of the things that we need to do to improve in a particular skill depend on knowledge that if we don't have access to it, we really have to reinvent it for ourselves. So I think about this in a business context often, that the people who move up are frequently those who have connections with people inside the industry who are successful, who can say, oh, this is how it works. You have to do it this way. You don't do this, avoid this, do this. And that allows you to just basically start at the frontier. You can start doing what is sort of the best practice off the bat. Whereas if you are isolated from that, you have to figure it out either through trial and error or guesswork, and it can be really difficult. Definitely the book publishing world is an example of this kind of opaque industry, and I can definitely see the difference between the people who have a number of contacts, they know how it works, and they can get a book deal and get published, and people who, maybe they spend 20, 30 years working on that first novel or that first manuscript, and they can't get it published.
These are really interesting points that you've come up with, and I think for all of us, I'm wondering along the way, did something point that you've either researched or hit you said, oh my gosh, I always thought it was this and it's really that, or the way you have to go about it is north and I've been looking south? Was there anything that really surprised you and changed the way you approach things?
Like, you mean in like book publishing, or use the example?
Oh, no, in any field, whether it's in any sport field, or getting better at sales.
Well, I mean, there's lots of surprises that you encounter along the way. Like, just again, to just continue this example that we talked about, I think one thing that really surprised me is that if you were trying to publish a book, for instance, most people get a book deal before they write the book. They don't write the book first. And so the person who writes the whole book and then tries to shop around for a publisher is actually at a disadvantage to the person who hasn't written the book yet. So there's lots of little weird things like this. I mean, I think every single field has these little rules of thumb, these little ideas that are very important for progress, but they're not widely known if you don't have access to it.
Scott, when you started writing this book, were you aiming, and I know you mentioned you have children, were you aiming at learning and mastering for younger children? Even what we master is kind of a big, strong word that we think of a pro golfer, a basketball player, a tennis player. But a student who might master for them a skill at sports or some type of activity in school, painting, or maybe even speech and debate or negotiating, something like that. Or was this for the entire map of the world, whether it's a business person or a cook or a chef? I
mean, both. I think definitely this is a book, like the intended recipient is someone who's going to look at it and say, you know what, I want to get better at whatever skill it is. And so I want to understand how that works. I want to break it down. I think you just can't help it when you have kids. You want to see them succeed and thrive in the world. And you recognize how difficult it can be. If you have a kid that maybe they're struggling with something, or maybe they're gifted, but they don't have a good outlet for it, you want to help them and you want to foster them. So I think understanding learning, it inevitably goes to your own children or the education of the people that are close to you.
New questions as you answer them, they're just coming into my mind. Because we're such a sports-oriented country, and so many parents, we have children who are playing on, it's either called travel teams or all-star or specialty teams. Have you been approached by a lot of people similar to this and saying, I want my son to be a relief pitcher, or my daughter wants to be a professional tennis player, or the best she can be, maybe not professional, but a high level. How can she master that skill? What things can she do better?
Yeah, I think for sports, this is one of the areas where we actually have a pretty good understanding of how people can perform at an elite level. So what I would do if I were looking at sports is just try to tap into what is already known. So what are who are the best coaches? What is the practice regimens? Again, this deliberate practice, you have your play and you figure out what you're good at, what you're not good at. You practice, you drill the things that you're not good at, and you get feedback. So I think these processes are well developed in professional athletics. And so if I were going to take as a model of how does, mastery of skills work, I would look to fields like elite athletics, music, maybe chess, to look at it. I think it's the areas that are sort of more informal outside of that where we often do a lot worse. So it's the business person who's like evaluating their hiring ability. We don't do any of those things. We don't do immediate feedback. We don't track our progress. It's just a lot of gut feeling and intuitions. And so I think, honestly, it's probably the case that what we need to do is move a lot of other fields to be closer to what we understand from elite sports.
Scott, before we go further, I'd like to let our audience know that you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Our guest today is Scott H. Young. His book is Get Better at Anything. And Scott, we're going to ask you, is there a website where we can learn more about this?
Yes, you go to scotthyoung.com. That's SCOTTHYOUNG.com.
Problem solving. I saw something, see if I have this right from your book. Mm-hmm. Low ability students benefit from structured problem solving, whereas high ability students benefit from less structured environment studies like that. Can you explain how that pans out in the real world?
Yeah, so this is from a literature called aptitude treatment interactions, which is basically how does some intervention, we're going to do this with the students, how does it impact learning? And sometimes students who have different levels of ability. Now, ability could be, we're talking about smarter students or less smart students, but it can also be different amounts of background knowledge. So it could be beginners versus ones who, come into the class already somewhat more prepared. And the general finding is that more structured approaches are better for lower ability students, because essentially the thing that they're going to do on their own is probably not going to match up with sort of like the best technique for solving that kind of problem. And so it helps to be in an environment where they are sort of forced to learn what is the right way to do something. Whereas for higher ability students who often have that structure or pattern in memory, it makes more sense to give them a chance to practice it, applying it in different contexts, different situations, so that they can, get that benefit of retrieving it and figuring out, okay, this is how it applies in this sort of ambiguous situation. The interesting thing about that research is that students often say that they enjoy more the technique that works worse for them. So lower ability students often prefer the less structured approaches, and higher ability students often prefer the more structured approach. So it's just one of the ways that our brains sometimes trick us into doing something.
Isn't that interesting? That's very interesting, because now I guess a lot of us would question that and think and say, well, sure, we'd all like to think we're higher ability, but if we really want to learn something and we're not in that class, or if we want to be among the higher ability, maybe we have to start out a little lower on the ladder.
Well, and I mean, it's often a continuous thing, right? Like you might be really high ability in golf, but low ability in quantum mechanics. Like there's a real sense in which once you have a lot of experience with something, you have a lot of knowledge in your head, and so you're in a different position than someone who's never approached something before. So I tend to think of it, another way of framing it is like low background knowledge, high background knowledge, because ability, sometimes that triggers this idea that like there's just high ability students and low ability students, whereas often what we're talking about is the students who have no idea what this subject is at all versus the ones like, oh yeah, I kind of know what this is about, or I kind of have learned some of this somewhere else already.
Scott, I mean, once again, another question just popped in. As you're going through now as an author of this book, and I'm sure giving talks and lectures, have you seen any either schools, school systems, subsystems, or businesses, someplace where they're using some of these techniques and you would say, that is really a good example? This group, whether it's a private or small school or instructional group, really knows how to get the message across? I
mean, there's lots of different types of pedagogical interventions, and they all have like their pros and cons in their situations that they work. But I tend to be fairly pro direct instruction. So direct instruction was a methodology developed by Siegfried Engelmann and a few other people, starting even in the 60s, I believe. And it tends to work by breaking down complicated skills into these simple components so that essentially anyone could learn them. And it's been quite successful in teaching a lot of young kids how to like read, do math, do some of these basic skills. I haven't seen it applied as much at like the higher levels, and I know there's different versions of it, but it seems to be the case that, if you're dealing with a complicated skill that you have no background in, something like direct instruction is probably a fairly efficient method, and the research sort of bears that out.
When you say direct instruction, is that what we know of as kind of the classroom teacher or the chemistry teacher who we learn by doing an experiment?
Well, I mean, I do think there is a certain sense that like there's sort of like a what they call lowercase direct instruction, which is just generally, okay, I'm going to be lecturing you, I'm going to be telling you how to solve this problem, and you're going to be doing practice. But the thing that I got from reading, especially Engelman has this like huge book called The Theory of Instruction, which he lays out his methodologies that like I have personally never taken a class where anyone does anything like this. Like it's these very quick cycles of like, I'm going to show this example, and then they get the kids in the class to, repeat, and then they do, okay, now question, what is this? This is this. And so there's these very tight feedback loops between presenting the material, doing some kind of question, some kind of cognitive work, and getting feedback. And that cycle, I think, it also increases the throughput because you're able to cover the material faster. So I wouldn't necessarily link it to the, professor sits at the chalkboard and like drones on for an hour. I don't think that's necessarily the most effective approach, but it is also a lot more direct and didactic than maybe some of the other more progressive forms of education that are popular as well.
Now, Scott, part of the book, of course, says there's 12 maxims. I hope I got the right number. So
yeah.
I think it starts around page 15 in your book. Can you talk about the first 4 just to tell us what they are, and then we can explore them further with you?
Yeah. So I sort of organized them into these 3 parts. So there's 4 for seeing, learning from others, 4 for doing, practice, and 4 for getting feedback. And so the first 4 are problem solving is search, creativity begins with copying, success is the best teacher, and knowledge becomes invisible with experience. And so they kind of deal with some of these key concepts, these key ways of thinking about observational learning through seeing that are very important. So the first one I talk about, problem solving as search, is this really landmark theory that explains how people solve hard problems, and it likens it to searching for a path in an abstract space of possibilities, kind of like looking through a maze. And the thing that I really gathered from reviewing a lot of this research is that most of what we know to be able to solve these problems comes from other people, and so this problem solving effort that we put in is very often first, okay, how do we reduce the size of this space so that we're not dealing with quintillions of possibilities and we have something that's actually manageable. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter, I talk about how creativity and imitation are often continuous part of the same process. So we start off in a kind of superficially imitative way of learning, and then that builds to creativity. And I talk about cognitive load theory, which is a very influential theory for instructional design by John Sweller and other colleagues. And the sort of idea here is that too much problem solving early on can actually make it harder to learn things, harder to understand the pattern that you're supposed to be learning. And so there's a lot about learning from examples there, and how by seeing how someone else can do it, we can often more quickly understand and generalize how to learn those things. Success is the best teacher is about the idea of building from a strong foundation, not only of the cognitive skills, but of the motivation, so that we have the self-efficacy to have that sort of fire of passion, of curiosity to learn things in the future. And then the final one, knowledge becomes invisible with experience, is about the idea that as you gain experience in a domain, you start to rely more on tacit knowledge, more on intuition, and often the explicit learning that you learned in school may even fade away, may even not be as accessible. And so that can create an obstacle to learning from people who are experts, but not expert teachers, because often they will not say things that are obvious to them, but they're not obvious to you. And so I spend some time talking about, how we can maybe overcome some of those problems in learning from people in workplaces, from mentors, from other people that know their stuff.
While you were writing the book, did you ever deviate a little bit on your free time and say, okay, now this weekend I'm going to try to learn to do the waltz or a square dance or just serve like whoever the best pro tennis player is, and go out and try to pick up a skill and see if what you're writing about actually applied to you in the real world? Yeah,
I mean, I've applied this methodology to lots of skills. I think we had talked on your show last time about my book Ultra Learning, and which was also talking about learning languages, computer programming, art, these kind of things. I mean, these days, I think the main thing that I can think about that's just coming to mind offhand is as learning to paint. And I just really see that as being something where this learning from others, learning what the techniques are is so important, because often you can do things that are like, why did this not work? And it can be very confusing and difficult to figure it out. And so learning from demonstrations has been a major part of my process there.
Scott, once again, before we go further, I'd like to let our audience know that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Bill Horan. Our guest today is Scott H. Young. He is the author of Get Better at Anything, and he's telling you the maxims that he goes by. Scott, can you tell us, is there a website where we can learn more about this?
Yes, they can go to scotthyoung.com.
Now, again, when you go back to your research, you have young children. Once you did this book and took care of it, were there any things that, just on a practical at-home matter, you said, we're going to change this, we're going to finish homework by 8 o'clock, or we're not going to do any homework on Sundays, or learning is best at 6 a.m. in the morning?
Well, my kids are 1 and 4, so I've yet to enter the real intensive academic school phase. So maybe this is a future conversation.
You're soft on them. They're 1 and 4, and you haven't. They're not reading the book.
They're not hitting the books. But I do think about because my son is now going to be entering in that phase where he's starting to learn to read. A lot of the research on learning to read just really struck home to me in a way that maybe it wouldn't have 5 years ago, because it's very clear that we take for granted thinking about reading. Reading is a very complicated skill where you just instantly take some squiggles on the page and turn them to words in your head and parse it. And you don't even think about what's going on to do that. It's hard to even break that down as a skill. So reading a lot of that research on there really made me think about, like, how can I set my son up in a way so that when he does go to school and he is in the teacher's room and they are going to teach reading, how can he be set up to be a reader? And then also, if he's struggling later when he is in school, if he's not on pace, what were the interventions that I would be like looking at? Okay, let's do this to improve.
I'm just guessing. I bet your wife is a teacher.
My wife's an accountant, but both my parents were teachers.
Were they?
So
okay.
I definitely have it in the family.
Oh, they're so proud of you right after this book. My son, the author. I
hope so. Yeah,
I bet they're out of the bookstores letting everyone know that, which is great. I think that's great. When I would be working in an office and someone would come in, I know there were always two philosophies. Here's the work to do. You go out there and some bosses didn't want people asking questions. And it was like, you're here to learn it. You should come in knowing it, figure it out. My philosophy was, if you don't get something, come and ask me a question. If they're going to ask me 20 questions on what day of the week it is, they're in the wrong field. But that never happened. And the questions would short-circuited. And if someone, myself or another coworker, had the answer, at least it would move them the next step ahead. Is there any philosophy that you've learned? Is it better to go in and dig it out on your own, or to get a little help from someone who's been there and done that?
Well, I mean, you raise a good point. I think in an office environment, you're always kind of weighing this sort of pedagogical benefits of, like, could I get clarification on this task? But with the social reality of, like, well, if I ask too many questions of this nature, I'm going to be dismissed or I'm going to be annoying someone. So I think the main thing I would look at is, how can I, what resources are there in the company for figuring out things? So I think good companies are pretty good about documenting their processes. They're pretty good about making explicit some of the things that they do as a protocol, so that you can just, go to some sort of training website and figure it out. I think it's a lot harder in an environment where it's all tacit knowledge. Everyone's been there for 20 years and they don't have time to talk about how they do things. Then it can be difficult as a newcomer, and you have to sort of negotiate that social relationship of, like, okay, do I talk to the boss or do I talk to that colleague, or, who's available, who's willing to help, and who's going to be gruff and unfriendly, that kind of thing.
Now, having written this book, do you get a lot of businesses or not-for-profits, et cetera, something that would be in the work world, so to speak, as opposed to academics, reaching out to you, or is it more the schools and teaching institutions?
Well, yeah, I get all sorts. I mean, I just recently had a conversation with a company that was making learning their theme for the year. We were talking about maybe working together. I think that this book in particular, because a lot of the focus is on not just how do we learn better as individuals, but creating environments that are conducive to learning. I think that is a conversation that is good to have with companies, because very often, as the employer, the person who's in charge of training and development, you have an ability to make knowledge more accessible, facilitate this ability to learn from other people, that they are genuinely hard to do if you just throw new employees into the shark pit and expect them to swim around and figure it out themselves.
You mentioned one of the the maxim: success is the best teacher. How would you use that in everyday life? Is it giving people simpler problems? If I came in now, I know nothing about speaking German. So would you probably teach me at below kindergarten level? And of course, if I got 10 or 12 words or one sentence, I'd be pretty proud of myself. I could order a cheeseburger or a schnoodle or whatever in Germany. How would you go about that with someone? How would you?
Well, so I think there's two takeaways from that idea. The first is that even skills that seem simple to us often have a kind of foundational building blocks of either background knowledge you need to have or like procedures that you need to have mastered before you can be successful at it. And so if you are struggling with a skill, if you go up onto the golf course and you can't hit the golf ball anywhere near the hole, or
you're
trying to read something in German, you're trying to read something in German and you can't make heads or tails of it. Breaking those down is very important. So that building that foundation is really important. That often we dismiss ourselves as lacking talent when what we really lack is the foundation. And I think that's important. And then the second thing is realizing that motivation for something new is often this little spark that needs to be sheltered. So you need to have an environment where you can get better at it. I think about public speaking as an example. I know many people who've gotten comfortable and confident public speaking starting at Toastmasters. Toastmasters is an organization where basically you can't do anything wrong. You can stand up on there and people will clap and applaud even if you gave the worst speech that was full of filler words and ums and hesitations. And yes, that's not realistic. It's not like being on Shark Tank or having someone grill you, but it allows you to feel comfortable, and that allows you to start developing the skill. And then the challenging stretch projects, the persevering through failure, all that stuff, I think is important, but it tends to come later. It comes once you have built some of that self-efficacy, some of that self-confidence to tackle those things.
And Scott, I just want to repeat something you said because I think you're going to make a lot of parents very happy with this. I picked up a few words, and you said very often people lack the foundation, not the talent. And the moms and dads out there, and you're one and I'm one, say, oh boy, there's still a chance. And I think that's so true. And I never thought of it that way. It's not maybe they weren't explained to them. Maybe they learned it at a wrong time in life, or a day when maybe the student, whatever age they are, wasn't just ready to learn. They weren't grasping, they didn't care, they had a personal problem or something. So it gives us all hope, I think. We just lack the foundation, not the talent to hit that golf ball.
Yeah, and I think focusing on the foundation is very important, and I think it's something that's, again, overlooked because we tend to view just, I'm good at this or I'm not good at this, and we don't investigate maybe why.
Scott, again, I want to tell our audience that you've been listening to Scott H. Young. His book is Get Better at Anything. And Scott, once again, please give us the website.
ScottHyoung.com, ScottHyoung.com.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Scott.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like our audience to know that you've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we'll continue our journey to success.